Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Ambassador Ruben Briggedy. I am Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs here at George Washington University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's high-level panel discussion on prioritizing African trade, policies, and practices. I want to especially thank our distinguished alumna and Elliott School Board Vice Chair, Julie Monaco, of City, for having initiated this event. Julie, thank you very much. Africa and trade and economic growth in Africa are subjects that are actually very dear to my heart. I am absolutely convinced that the next chapter of Africa's history will be defined by private sector-led economic growth, and as such is a topic that is absolutely worthy and timely for study. We are pleased to have today two panels of noted experts on the subjects of trade in Africa, and we are thankful to City for having helped to bring such an esteemed group to campus to interact with our faculty and students in the midst of the very busy IMF World Bank spring meetings. I'm pleased also that with the Institute for International Economic Policy here at the Elliott School, we have a leading institution on campus here with expertise on the study and trade and development in Africa. Furthermore, one of my first goals as Dean of the Elliott School was to establish an Institute for African Studies. And let me tell you a quick story. It's a true story. Most of my stories are true. Standing at this very podium, I became Dean on October 1st, 2015. And in my first public speech to the Elliott School community with the president, the board chair, and everyone assembled, in my first speech, 2 hours into the job, I declared that we would create a new Institute for African Studies before the start of the next academic year. I didn't ask anybody's permission. I didn't say we were going to convene a committee to study and think about whether or not we should do it. I just said we're going to do it. And I'm pleased that that initiative has attracted so much support from all members of the Elliott School community, our alumni, our students, our faculty, and we're thrilled to be partnering with existing institutions like IIEP to further develop the study of Africa here at the Elliott School. So, accordingly, I look forward to many future events on trade and development issues in Africa, and hope that many of you will return to the Elliott School in the future. Now it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Peter Sullivan, head of the Africa Public Sector Group at City, who will moderate the first panels on policies related to prioritizing African trade. Peter and esteemed panelists, welcome to the Elliott School. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing the panel. To my left, we have Michael Moore, who's a professor of economics and international affairs at George Washington University. Next to him, we have Ambassador Robert Holliman, who's the former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. Next to him is Jose Reese, who's the Practice Manager for Trade and Competition at the World Bank. And then last but not least is Kimberly Clayman, Director of City's Government Affairs, with a particular focus on trade. I think, as Ambassador said, trade is certainly rising to the top of the many African sovereigns in this environment of growing economic nationalism and protectionism. The OECD recently stated that a 10% increase in criminal cost of trade by the US, EU, and China would reduce GDP by 1 to 1.5%. So I think we're certainly facing an environment of many challenges and potentially risks, but obviously with that, some of the opportunities. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael maybe to set us up and give us a sense of what is the current environment, what's the outlook for trade globally.
Thank you very much, and appreciate the invitation. I'm the only one in this panel that only had to walk upstairs on one flight of stairs to arrive here. The rest of the folks have come from further away. Really appreciate their participating today. We obviously face a time of really unprecedented uncertainty about the role of the multilateral trade system. Recently, there have been stresses in the past, but I think what's different about today is that the commitment of the big defenders of the multilateral rules-based system is really in question. And this institutional system that we have set up in the post-war period that's rules-based is particularly important for developing countries, because when you get down to it, in the absence of rules, only the powerful will prevail. A rules-based system is particularly important for developing countries, and the restrictions or the obligations that come with the multilateral system have been enormously important. Now, many headlines point to President Trump's election, Brexit, and recent French presidential polls to suggest that there's really an unexpected manifestation of deep skepticism about the multilateral system currently. But the fact is that these concerns have been growing for some time. I think for people that believe that somehow this all started with the Brexit vote are really underestimating the degree of concern, especially in the developed world, because of the recognition that there are downsides with globalization. There are enormous opportunities, but there are also downsides. But we should also not forget that the last big multilateral trade deal was in 1994, the Uruguay. It has been a long time since we had a multilateral trade agreement. Yes, we've had some progress with the trade facilitation agreement and some progress towards the trade in services agreement. But the fact is that the Doha round that was started in 2002 is, I think, by any fair measure, has been a failure. Countries have simply moved on as the impasse of the WTO has grown. The Obama administration turned instead to Trans-Pacific Partnership, definitely not including Africa in that priority. TTIP, definitely not including Africa in that priority. And it is this focus on regional agreements, on bilateral agreements, both in the United States and elsewhere, I think represents a potentially fundamental shift in the trading system, and one that potentially leaves Africa out, at least in terms of the focus of for the U.S. and other developed countries. And remember, these problems were true before President Trump became president. These are long-standing. So how does an African government deal with this increased trade and investment uncertainty? And I think that's uncertainty is the critical word. So suppose the regional and regional bilateral trade agreements become the focus. So what do? Well, this increasing complexity, because you're dealing not with just WTO rules, but a host of different regulations for each individual trading partner, creates particular stresses for developing countries, especially ones with limited resources. And I think that's particularly problematic for Africa. Now, the Elliott School has has tried to offer at least some help in this regard for developing countries. For some years, we've provided training to foreign embassy staff working in DC to learn about the U.S. trade system. It's in conjunction with the Washington International Trade Association, WIDA. We've also done this in Guatemala to help Guatemalan officials, and we'd also like to try and do this for African officials. It's important to understand the details of the way the U.S. runs things so African countries can more fully exploit the opportunities in the United States. But I also urge African countries not to think about what you can do to help trade with particular trade partners, but undertake policies that can help you regardless of the economic architecture that you see in the future. Excessive reliance on China or the United States can leave you vulnerable to unexpected shocks. If you undertake policies that will help regardless of the economic architecture, I think African countries will be much better served. So let me just say a couple of words about what those type of activities might be. Sure, trade liberalization is important. I'm a trade economist. I'm going to think that's critical. But improving the business environment inside the country is also critical. And the business environment, infrastructure, logistics are things that countries can do without waiting for permission from other countries, without relying on the U.S. to turn its attention towards Africa. Instead, deal with the internal barriers to exports that can be a problem regardless of who your formal trading partners might be. So these behind the border reforms are really critical. And we're going to have a second round of this, I hope, and I will come back to this. But let me just say that the World Bank, and especially has provided enormous public good in measuring behind the border barriers, the doing business indicators, the trade, the logistics performance indicators, the service trade and restriction index. These are measures that can help countries compare their performance against others. You can have deep problems with the specific numbers, that's fine, but it is important. It's an important gauge to measure your progress. Now, globalization has continued apace even without the international agreements. Discussions about trade, especially here in Washington, tend to focus on the pieces of paper that governments sign. But the reality is that globalization has continued apace without the Doha round, without new multilateral trade agreements. Companies have increasingly complex supply chains that many countries around the world can take advantage of. Technology links the world. Foreign direct investment flows continue without these further trade agreements. So Africa has lagged behind the rest of the world in recent decades in terms of global and regional integration. I look at that as an opportunity. Because there has been less growth in those areas in the past, that means that there are more opportunities that can be exploited, especially if Africa undertakes good policies domestically that help them regardless who their particular trade partners might be. So, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Robert, maybe turning to you, and certainly from a U.S. perspective, having been in the Obama administration and now with President Trump coming in, and I'd like to hear your views on sort of where things may go from here and how it may affect some of the African sovereigns.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation to be here. The nice thing about coming out of an administration is that I can actually say anything that's on my mind. And the nice thing coming out of the administration that I came out of is that most things I would have said earlier are what I will say now. What I think has really changed is the state of discussion about the rules around trade. That is a major change. We certainly look at the election and recognize there's a major difference in approach to how our administration and this administration are looking at trade. We very much believe that a rules-based system for trade, if the right rules were put in place that reflected a modern inclusive economy, would benefit both the United States and our trading partners, and work very actively to try to influence those rules in ways that we felt would be good for our country, but also good for the globe. We were able to achieve things like the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which was the first agreement of any type since the inception of the WTO. And if one looks at the sub-Saharan African countries, you see that the potential cost savings by reducing the friction around trade, because when the Trade Facilitation Agreement is fully implemented in place, will save 12 to 23.5% roughly on average the costs around individual transactions and trading. And so reducing that friction, that unnecessary cost, will allow more participants globally, but allow more participants in Africa to have the benefits of trade. And so we believe that those were truly win-win areas and the work that we tried to do together. Our office, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, is part of the Executive Office of the President. As Michael Moore indicated, we had a very active agenda that I won't go back through, except to say that we believe that we should take progressive ideas and bring those into the economic reality of trade. That's why President Obama made early commitments in his campaign to ensure that new trade agreements that we struck had enforceable environmental and labor protections, which we accomplished in the TPP agreement and elsewhere. That's why we believed it's important to include new areas like the digital economy. And I'll talk about that later, but the TPP and other agreements that we were striking through USTR were all designed to ensure that we modernized, we had an inclusive trading regime that provided opportunities and reduced the unnecessary barriers and friction to trade. For us and for our administration, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, is really the centerpiece of how we approach our relationship and our trading partners in sub-Saharan Africa. That initial legislation, which was approved when President Clinton was in office, was extended in 2015 for a 10-year period of time. And it really provides the framework around which African, sub-Saharan nations can take advantage of opportunities to trade with the U.S. under the most favorable trade terms that we have of any countries with whom we don't have free trade agreements. And indeed it means that most goods can be brought into the U.S. at essentially duty-free levels, and there are currently 38 of 49 sub-Saharan African countries who are eligible for AGOA benefits. I think, and I know I have friends and former colleagues in the audience who would say we want more of those benefits to be taken advantage of. There are many lines, including in areas of textiles, where all of the advantages aren't fully being utilized by our African partners. But what we do know is that this has substantially increased the amount of trade between the U.S. and Africa. We now have $37 billion in two-way goods trade with sub-Saharan Africa, and those numbers have been going up. And so we think that is a good framework. I will say that while the new administration, to the best of my knowledge, has not yet talked in any great detail about what their plans are vis-a-vis Africa or trade, many of their key officials have not yet been put into place. The AGOA renewal, which was a bipartisan effort in Congress, extends throughout this presidency, a second term if there's a second term or a change in administrations. And so we do know that the continuity and the framework of this life, this sort of heartbeat that we have that ties together the U.S. and Africa under AGOA will continue. And hopefully, and I believe it will be a central part of how the U.S. looks at the region. Lastly, let me just talk a couple of minutes about development finance. I sat as USTR's representative on the board of OPIC, which is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and we are the development finance agency of the U.S. government. And I think it's important to note that the U.S. has many ways of engaging around trade, whether they're through trade agreements or things like the AGOA Act, or the type of efforts we have to support private sector investment around the world, but particularly in Africa. OPIC is the core way in which we support new private sector projects that are designed to put targeted investments into countries where they can make a difference and where there will be a potential shortage of support for private sector investments without some benefit by the U.S. government. I will say, in terms of a benefit by the U.S. government, one great benefit to the U.S. government is that the OPIC program actually returns a positive return on investment to the U.S. government. And so in addition to being a development financing agency, it also helps lower the deficit. So I think if you're talking about win-wins, those are great opportunities. You can pursue goals of ensuring that there is more targeted investments in countries who need it, and you can do so at no cost and indeed a benefit to the U.S. taxpayer. Last full year that I sat on the OPEC board, we made $3.7 billion in new commitments through OPEC. Those were in areas of financing, investment funds, and risk insurance. In my tenure, just alone on the board, between projects that our board approved and projects that we were able to approve at a staff level with about board approval, I counted 60 projects in Africa alone that we approved in the 2014 to 2017 period. Of the 3.7 billion total last year, globally, 1.08 billion of those were in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the largest single portion of investments in any part of the world by OPEC. And those investments were heavily promoting things like the U.S. Power Africa initiative that seeks to double the amount of availability and access to electrical power in sub-Saharan Africa. So I mention this because that work continues. There's a great career and non-partisan board that supports OPEC, and it helps channel good projects, good ideas, countries who are in need, and private sector investors who want to lead the way in those investments. And there are many great stories I can tell you by drilling down into projects that we supported around providing minibuses for taxi service in South Africa, to programs to ensure that farmers had access to the products and information they need. But of those 60 that I counted just in my tenure, I think you can go to the OPEC.gov website, you can drill down into those, and you can see some really exciting projects that are tested and that will return a monetary investment, but also return value to the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I can personally attest to the value that OPEC has brought, and city's been a great partner with OPEC, and the growth in sub-Saharan Africa has been tremendous. So hopefully we'll make it last. Which I think is a nice segue into Jose. Is what are multilaterals doing in helping support some of the trade flows, and more importantly about the trade policies and such. I believe World Bank has just released a report to the G20, so maybe if you want to reference that.
Well, thank you very much for inviting the World Bank Group. If you try to find my name in this booklet, you won't find it. Manuel Gonzalez, my director, is supposed to come, but as was previously said here by the ambassador, we are at the start of the spring meetings, so it's really hard in terms of our agenda. But she would be really willing to come, but some other events needed her presence. So as Peter mentioned, my notes are primarily based on this report that was launched a couple of days ago, a joint report from the IMF, World Bank, and World Trade Organization. And the title is Making Trade an Engine of Growth for All. And basically, the main point is that trade is central to the effort to end global poverty, which is for the World Bank, is our corporate goal. The evidence that we present in the report for the G20 shows that increased trade integration helped to drive economic growth in advanced and developing economies in the last decades, lifting millions out of poverty. A couple of figures about this. World merchandise trade as a share of GDP was at around 30% in 1988, and is about 50% in 2008. The average income grew by 24% globally, and income for the bottom 40% of world population increased by close to 50%, driven by large countries such as China and India. While causality is always complicated to identify, there is strong evidence of association between accelerated growth and trade openness, and that growth is associated with poverty reduction, For example, the income growth of about 20% increases almost 1-for-1 with average income growth. From our standpoint, working with developing countries, despite the uncertainty over the future of global trade, as referred to already, there's a lot of interest and disposal from the side of developing countries with the support of multilateral institutions, to leverage trade as a driver of economic diversification, job creation, and economic growth. You know this, but just to remind three important drivers or important avenues for developing countries. Regional and global value chains, despite the deceleration of this special splitting up of production in recent years, are still an avenue for developing countries to integrate to global trade through tasks and services and other activities. New technologies have helped countries to trade services more and more. Merchandise trade growth has been slowing down, but trade in services has the rate of growth has been kept up. And e-trade, was referred by the ambassador, is a new kid in town that is really providing some opportunities for countries and a lot of interest in the developing world, as many countries see this as an opportunity to leapfrog. Perhaps we can discuss a bit about this. One specific point that we make, I mean, we see trade through the lens of development, or the links between trade and development, and especially in particular to end extreme poverty. And there is another report that we produced again in partnership with the WTO in 2015, which is the role of trade in ending poverty. We had the opportunity to discuss USTR. And the report stresses that the extent to which trade contributes to reducing poverty is dependent on complementary policies and institutional environment. I think this is absolutely key, and this is what we are observing worldwide. And this has to do with agriculture, with the role of the rural economy, fragility in conflict, gender issues, and the nature of the informal economy. Finally, in this first intervention, I wanted to just reiterate, and this is what the report tries to bring up very strongly, that there is an intense focus on trade policy with new challenges developing for an open, rules-based trade system. But the system is absolutely essential to achieve what we have as roadmap goals of reducing trade poverty. With the right policies, a mix of openness to trade, to drive growth, with a strong safety net, and longer-term policies to build competitiveness, growth of the education and skills, countries can benefit from the great opportunities that trade brings, while also lifting up those who have been left behind.
Thank you very much. So Kimberly, maybe we can turn to the private sector and have a look at multinational companies and what we're doing to help implement some of these agreements and the role that they play.
Sure, thank you. And also I can say I'm a proud graduate of the Elliott School as well. So in thinking about this topic, and thinking that we are facing the backlash for anti-globalization environment, whether those issues are raised by members of society or politicians, companies continue to support trade and investment agreements and the frameworks that those rules set out. And because that framework governs how companies, both large and small, medium-sized enterprises, operate in that particular market. And with that transparent system, it sets up a rule of law trading system, which is the foundation of how we operate. And we encourage all governments to seek to put those into place. When thinking about the commitments that have existed in trade agreements, referring back to what Professor Moore said and Ambassador Holliman, when trade agreements were first being put into place, they were largely focused on tariffs or agricultural market access issues. And then we saw in the Doha round, or in the Uruguay round, we saw some of those expanded to include rules on services and intellectual property rights. And who was pressing for those rules? It was the multinational companies, because we were no longer just exporters or importers, but we saw the proliferation of services companies who were now seeking to supply services cross-border or to invest in those markets abroad to supply financial services, express delivery services, telecommunication services. And with it now, with the advancement in technology, we see a whole new set of rules that multinational companies have been pressing for. But what's interesting about the new rules is that it's not just the traditional benefiting the company who's seeking to invest in the foreign market. It's not just getting rid of equity caps so that a company can own its business, or that seeking that a government not limit the number of licenses that it grants to a particular sector. So for example, that's a prevalent issue in financial services. But now we're looking at rules that also benefit the societies that the companies are operating in. And let's think about what those are. Ambassador Holliman referred to a couple of those, as did Professor Moore. They're in the e-commerce area, allowing for the free flow of data, prohibiting data localization requirements. Those kinds of rules not only set up a framework for the multinational companies, but small and medium-sized companies who are developing within a market. For example, within Africa, I think we have a number of great examples that I think others will talk about later. It ensures that they can also operate on the internet, sell their products, and send them around the globe. There are rules on labor and environment. Multinational companies support those. Multinational companies want to be good stewards of the environment and the way that they treat the employees that work for them. We are also seeing rules set out around regulatory cooperation, which in the past really wasn't thought about. But now, because because companies are engaging in global supply chains, we need certainty around what those regulatory frameworks look like, and having them consistent from market to market ensure that we can operate seamlessly. Those new rules we have seen set up in a couple of agreements. One is the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and I know, I see my colleague here from UPS will be talking about that later, I'm sure. But that agreement doesn't just set up rules for companies, but it actually reduces the cost of trade, and that is good for both governments, its citizens, and the companies. We've seen some of these rules in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trade and Services Agreement is the first agreement in services negotiated since the General Agreement on Trade and Services back in 1996. Some of these new rules on e-commerce would appear there. Under the Obama administration, the bilateral investment treaty review resulted in new and inclusive rules on the environment and on labor, which had never been put into a bilateral investment treaty in the past. So the nature of the issues covered by trade and trade agreements are largely based on how companies are evolving in their work. And so I think that enables a more true partnership between multinational companies with the governments and the countries that they're operating in. I just want to close with one particular example before we move on to our next round of questions, and that's transparency. That has been, as I mentioned earlier, the bedrock of being able to operate in a foreign market. 20 years ago, transparency meant publishing your laws and regulations, maybe having a place that companies or interested persons could come and read them. I remember we used to have a reading room at USTR where people could come and read the rules. But now transparency means something very different. It means encouraging society, both companies and citizens, to work together on formulating what the regulations and laws of the country will be. So now transparency means publishing draft laws and regulations to get input from interested persons. It means having that period of time for that input open long enough that people can become aware of what the new proposed rules are. It means that the government reads those recommendations, takes in, maybe has some meetings with those, if it has questions about what's been submitted. It means that when it puts out its final rule, that it responds to the substantive comments that the government has received to say, well, we received a certain number of comments that recommended this, and therefore we took a certain approach. Or we believe that that's not the right approach for our government, so we've decided to go another direction. And finally, in putting into place that final rule, transparency means giving those that have to abide by the new rule and regulation time to come into compliance with that new regime that has been put into place. So in closing, I think the role of multinational companies has changed over time with respect to trade. Sure, companies still want a liberal market to operate in. They still want to own their own company. They still want to be able to expand as needed to increase their presence in the market. But companies have also become the champions of these new types of rules that I think serve a broader benefit.
Thank you, Kimberly. Appreciate we're only about 15 minutes left of this panel, so we did have a series of questions, but before opening it up to the audience, maybe we can just expand a little bit maybe on the services and digitization and the impact on Africa, and particularly how African governments can help leverage that and promote that to advance inter-Africa trade. And then we'd like to maybe just touch on regional integration. I think there might be some divergent views on the panel around the benefits of integration. But maybe, Robert, if I could maybe ask you to maybe just touch on the services and digitization. So I know you wanted to come back to that.
Sure. Thank you, Peter. So if you look at the world, but particularly if you look at Africa, I think you look at it and say, where are the big opportunities that in some respects are unique in sub-Saharan Africa, or where sub-Saharan Africa has an opportunity to grow extraordinarily well. I think the area around mobility, broadband access, for what that means for everything like access to information, to e-commerce, to education, is the big opportunity that's there. It's also not an opportunity that is necessarily focused on international trade. My view is that all of this is a continuum. You have community trade, you have national trade, and you have international trade. And many times the same opportunities are there, including the ability to have the right rules around things like transparency and openness so that people can compete. New businesses, whether they're small or large, can arise and compete. Sub-Saharan Africa has Africa has 557 million unique mobile subscribers today. That's about 46% of Africa. It's the second largest region in the world after Asia Pacific, but it's also the least penetrated in terms of unique mobile access and broadband. And so I think when you look at this opportunity, you can also see that there's a lot of growth that is on the horizon. It's estimated that there'll be 725 million unique subscribers by 2020. So there's a rapid increase. And so how do you take that increase and combine it with the opportunity to expand in your community, in your nation, and internationally? Well, getting the right rules around trade are an important part of doing that. Kimberly referenced the new sort of digital provisions around services and others that were really embodied in the Digital 2000 obligations that were in the TPP. Those things around cross-border data access, making sure that consumers and business can use the technology of their choice, embedding the principle of a free and open internet, are fundamentally important, and they're fundamentally important to link to this growth in broadband opportunity, increase of mobile computing, and what that can mean at the community level, as well as the continental level of Africa. And so I think with that broadband access, and again, I can talk later about more of the things that can be done in Africa to promote that broadband access, but with the growth we see with the right rules in place, it should make the trading opportunities, information opportunities, a significant benefit for the continent.
Any other contributions?
Well, just to add a couple of things. One, the governance issues, the transparency issue, the rule of law, that's all internal. That all can be done without any trade agreement with anybody. Those are good for a country, period. Period. You don't have to wait for the Trump administration to decide to have a trade agreement with Africa to do those things. That's good. The domestic infrastructure, whether it be broadband or better roads, that's more expensive. That you may need foreign investment, but that is helped by good transparency, good governance. This is all part of, as I began this discussion, the arguments sometimes are about trade policy. What we want is trade outcomes, and sometimes that's not dictated by writing down the obligations on a piece of paper. Do things that make sense, regardless of what people in other government capitals decide to do. There's just some good basic stuff. And I mean, just one little factoid from a paper from Trump formerly at the World Bank about transit times in Africa. So now, don't take this number too literally because it's an estimate from one study. But she and her colleague came up with an estimate that reducing inland trade transit times by 1 day. 1 day is the equivalent to a 2 percentage point decrease in tariffs in the importing country. So you can have enormous benefits if you reduce the internal costs. You don't have to wait for anybody else to do that. So grab hold of your opportunities. Don't wait for other people.
I would just highlight the group of digital issues as, they're hard, right? They're hard to understand. And I think regardless of what region we're talking about, regulators whose job is to protect citizens, to put regulation into place, this is an opportunity where regulators can partner with the multinational companies that are operating in their markets. Because it's not easy to understand how companies protect the privacy of their customers. It's not easy to understand how companies protect for cybersecurity reasons. And there seems to be some myths out there where regulators in the past and even currently have thought that in order to protect the data for cybersecurity reasons or privacy, I have to have it in my own country. I can't have it being located elsewhere. And I think until there is this work together and partnership to really understand these new technological advancements that are going on all of the time, regulators will turn inward. But that is not to the benefit of the society as a whole. And so I just wanted to highlight that this is an area, I think, whether you are IBM, Microsoft, UPS, or Citi, because we certainly see ourselves as a technology company, where, invite us in. Invite us in and let us explain to you how we accomplish these goals. And we'll work with you so that it can be a win-win on both sides in terms of the policy outcome for governments to do what they need to do and companies to be able to operate in the manner that they need to do in the global economy.
Perhaps speaking on what Michael was mentioning about trade costs. We have estimates, don't take the link with it as well, but we have estimates that intra-African trade costs are perhaps the highest in terms compared to the average. And are like, not magnitude 50% higher than East Asia. So this is a topic that that is important to address. I agree, it's basically at the national level, but this will have implications for regional integration as well. And I agree with the ambassador, it's not either or. It's, regional integration can be seen as a way, a stepping stone to further integrate to the rest of the world. And by addressing the trade costs that are pretty high, I think it's the first step, very important step.
Great, thank you. I think with permission of my co-moderator, Maggie, if we can take maybe 10 minutes to get some questions from the audience. But Michael may have to excuse himself earlier because he's got a class again.
I am a professor, and I do have students, including one here who has paid a lot of money to hear me talk. I do have I'll have to leave in 5 minutes, so my apologies.
Right, so let's open up the questions.
Well, thank you. My name is Kingsley.
Have a microphone.
Yeah, Thank you. My name is Kingsley Mahalu. I'm a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. I wanted to raise the question of intra-African trade. I think that's really the path for Africa for so many reasons. They're not very competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And they have issues in terms of standards of products, and some parts of the world do have protectionist subsidies, regardless of their rhetoric about free trade. So I think this is an area we really need to look at. Intra-African trade, 13% of all African trade is of all African global trade is intra-African, and that's the lowest around the world. When you compare that to 70% EU, 50-something% from North America. So that's something I think that needs to look at. And then secondly, the whole question of the S&P provisions in the WTO agreement. How can Africa more actively take advantage of those provisions to develop its own competitive export base? Because without doing that, the continent just continues to export raw materials, and that's not good for it. Thank you.
Maybe we'll take another question, then we can combine the two.
Hi, my name is Tana, and I'm a student at GW. My question is related to what Mrs. Kibali just talked about inviting multinational companies to deal with African countries on how to develop regulations. I have a concern because sometimes we have very weak countries in terms of economic and political situations, and they deal with very big multinational that have maybe sometimes their own money is higher than the GDP of the country. So how can you have fair negotiation between a weak country and a big multinational? And when we know that sometimes African countries really need those companies in the country, so how the negotiation can be fair?
Thank you. Who would like to start? Maybe Michael?
Well, parting shot. Intra-African trade is far lower than it should be. By any measure, it's low. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. It's internal barriers, it's infrastructure, networks of the rail and highway networks aren't linked together. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done. One aspect of that I'm a committed multilateralist, so I tend to think in that way. I would not encourage African countries to pursue bilateral deals or even regional deals with other African countries to become more integrated, like NAFTA or the EU. I don't think that that's going to work well for Africa. Trade diversion, ending up importing a product from a high-cost source because they're a trade partner, is a real problem. Having said that, encouraging intra-regional trade in Africa, so it's more like the rest of the world, that means that there's enormous opportunities. How you get there in an efficient way is the tricky part of it. But again, I think integrations of networks, of roads and rail shipping is probably a key part of that. And that, of course, that's the most expensive thing to do, this is where you need to reach out to other, the development agencies to help you in that way. But I would really advise against the regional trade agreements. Regional trade is good. Regional trade agreements, I'm more skeptical about. That's my last word. So thank you very much. And Ian, we can go torture you about devaluations right now. So, okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Sorry to rhyme.
Maybe just give the panelists a last chance to maybe address the two questions that were raised, and I think we'll have to go over to the next panel. How are we doing?
Look, I won't belabor points I think that we made, and I think there's opportunities throughout this process. I probably would like to actually, I don't speak for a multinational company, but I think to the very good question that was portrayed, I would find whether as a government official in a large country, but I think it's the same question I would ask if I were in a small or developing country, which is, show me how the other countries have handled the same situation. I mean, that's where I would ask transparency. What a country doesn't need to do is invent an entire set of new rules and regulations for its areas of trade, because that's duplicative. And for large multinationals, it makes it harder for them to service a market. I'd say, let me see how you handle this in trade agreements, whether it's the WTO, how you've done in regional agreements. We see some of our large neighbors. Be transparent, and then I would talk to that company and go through it, but I wouldn't try to create a whole new set of rules or reinvent the rules. I would look at models that should be transparent and should be open as the basis to move forward.
Thank you. I fully agree on regional integration in Africa. And let me share some ideas that we have about implementation of these agreements. First, and I think we all know about this, it's more than simply removing tariffs. It's really addressing the behind the border issues that constrain trade. And since Mike cited, had a very nice reference to our work in the World Bank, I also want to say that I fully agree with him. It's not about signing agreements that will reduce trade costs. It's really having the drive to a more holistic process to deeper regional integration. And I think that it goes beyond trading goods. And I think that trading services is a very important topic in the agenda. And this calls for regulatory reform, which are basically national issues. And finally, there's need to do work at both the national and supranational level. And this is something that we have been trying and quite frankly struggling with, is to work with regional agencies and at the same time with the countries to move this agenda forward. And there are, as we all know, there are several political economy issues that prevent us to move faster in this area. But I think, I definitely think that this is agenda, and there is a resurgence currently in several regions of the world on the need to further regional integration.
And just to maybe combine a little bit the question, just to clarify, when I was speaking about inviting us in and being that partner, it wasn't necessarily as a negotiation, but let us share our experiences with you, as Ambassador Holliman was saying. Let us share our experiences with you, because Citi operates in 100 countries. And for example, if we think about the trade facilitation agreement and the requirements under that agreement, we know how other countries facilitate their customs procedures, how they release fees, how they collect those duties, and we have experience in that, and we can share with governments who are seeking to implement their trade facilitation agreement commitments, how that is operationalized. And we also use the services of many of our clients. And so we have experience on that side as well. So we are using certain companies' cloud technologies, for example. And so my comments were more in a let us help share those experiences, and governments at the end of the day make the decision about how they want to proceed in implementing their trade commitments. I also thought the trade facilitation agreement was a good example of having different opportunities in the way that African governments can implement their commitments. There were different levels of commitments in that agreement. So I think oftentimes it's overwhelming if you're a government. And I can say this, I worked for the government for 20 years in the US. It can be overwhelming to think, I have to take on all of these commitments. How am I going to make it all work together and not be sued in the WTO, for example? And so that's where I think the trade facilitation agreement did a good job of giving the control to the governments as to what they wanted to achieve in a certain time period. And then in connected to that, that's where I think companies, whether it's Citi or another company who have experience in those areas, can look at what the country has agreed to take on, look what might be taken on in the next 5 years, 10 years down the line, and help governments think about, okay, does it make sense just to implement? Is it more cost effective to only implement this one piece now? Or should we look more broadly and try to implement more even though we haven't signed up to do it? So I think, again, I think there are partnerships there to be had with the companies that are operating in African markets.
Thank you. Well, I think, as Kimberly said, I think the next panel will hopefully get us into the practices and how particularly the private sector can help the public sector in implementing and identifying sort of more of the best practices. So hopefully the panelists will agree to stay on, and then at the reception, hopefully we can carry on the discussion a bit. But please join me in thanking the panelists for their great contributions.
My name is Maggie Chen. I'm a professor of economics and international affairs here at GW. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you and introduce to you our 4 distinguished speakers at the practice panel. So sitting right next to me is Ms. Florine Lizer, the President and CEO of Corporate Council on Africa. And next to Florine is Laura Lang, the President of Global Public Affairs at UPS. And our third speaker is Anamasu Tadase, the President and the Chief Executive of the Trade and Development Bank. Last but not least is John Ahern, Global Head of Citi's Trade Services. Welcome. So, in the last couple of years, what we have seen happening in Africa is a deceleration of economic growth from about 5%, to 3.5%, right? And this is probably due to the challenging conditions a lot of these economies are facing, including the declining commodity prices, the rising policy uncertainties, the droughts, et cetera, et cetera. But we know trade offers opportunities in conditions like this, right? And in fact, from our last panel, we know Africa has a lot of untapped trade potential, including trade with itself. Right? The intra-regional trade, as Lindsay mentioned, only accounts for about 18% of total trade in Africa. 18? 13. Oh, wow. And then the value added in our manufacturing trade in Africa is very low. So that means we have a lot of potential going forward that we can explore further to promote trade and promote economic growth and development. So now my first question is for Florine. So in your role in the Corporate Council Africa, do you see changes and opportunities in trends in Africa trade happening right now?
So the resounding answer on that.
Sorry. I should know that.
No, you're smart enough to have it to start with. So clearly the answer to that is yes. I think that the business community at this point, even in the current circumstances where there's a lot of uncertainty, feel very strongly that there is an economic stake that they have in Africa and why. It's still the fastest growing market in the world. Well, the second fastest growing in the world. It's undergoing the most rapid urbanization rate of any region. We all know that of Africa's 1 billion people, they're currently 50% are under the age of 20. And despite the recent shocks and changes in the African market due to the commodity crisis, spending by Africa's consumers and businesses already totals about $4 trillion and is set to grow even more. And so this provides a number of opportunities, specifically new consumers for U.S. business, but also a new workforce. And so what we're seeing is that there are some downsides, as you mentioned, but actually when one looks closely, there's a reason why so many businesses, U.S. businesses, and businesses from all over the world, whether it's China or Europe or Brazil or Malaysia, are flocking to Africa. The other thing that businesses say is that they are there, U.S. businesses, not necessarily to do only good things, as in corporate social responsibility. Our companies do a lot of that, but they're actually there to do well. Africa is very profitable, and the return on investment in Africa is higher than it is in many other regions of the world. So there's a lot that has to be looked at. We've got the tech boom and internet connectivity that's rising rapidly there. Africans are transforming their markets through a lot of new technologies. You've got technology hubs that are expanding there. There are more than 300 of those hubs now spread across 33 countries, 33 cities in 42 countries across the continent. And so Africa is now more connected now than they've ever been before. And then just last two things I'd like to mention that I think are important trends. Trade facilitation, everyone's been talking about that. Everyone knows how critical it is, and with the enactment of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, we now have 19 African countries that have acceded to the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. I'm very excited about that because that's something that I worked on for years when I was at USTR. And coming from a place where initially the Africans weren't sure whether they really even wanted to sign on, I think there's much more of an understanding now that this is something they're doing for themselves, and something that's going to support greater trade amongst Africans. And so with TFA, which sets that roadmap to better customs processes and more efficient movement of goods, I think that what we're going to see is definitely a reduction in the cost of doing business in Africa, both for the Africans as well as for others, greater intra-African trade, and then allowing them, as was said earlier, to use that as a platform to be competitive in global trade. The last thing I want to mention is the tremendous opportunities that we're seeing in Africa in terms of manufacturing, developing an industrial base and value addition. And that's something also that many of you know is close to my heart because of all the years that I worked on AGOA. And I don't think anyone claims that AGOA has done all that it could do. There are a lot of supply side constraints that have been difficult for the Africans to overcome, and we can talk a little bit about those later. But the bottom line is that Africa is now being seen as the global manufacturing floor, and many are looking for ways to incorporate the Africans into global and regional value chains. And I've had the privilege of seeing in many factories all across the continent the results of that, where people, because of the lower labor cost and the ability of the Africans to use those early industrial skills in producing not just footwear and apparel, but also value-added agricultural products, and I've seen that myself. And so to the extent that Africa poses an opportunity for those who are looking for places to effectively and efficiently produce the goods that are needed. We can talk about services as well, but for the moment, this is just about goods. You know, everything that we have, the clothes we wear, this microphone, you know, anything, you know, your shoes, his tie, have all been made in a factory somewhere. And so, you know, many of us look at Africa as this is now an opportunity for Africans to be producing many of those items and moving up value chains to sectors where China is moving out and the Africans can move in. So from our point of view, in terms of the environment, we think that there are tremendous opportunities in Africa, and we can talk about the challenges as well. We're not going to be naive about it, but I'm sort of in the group, and the CCA members are in the area of seeing tremendous opportunities in Africa.
Thank you, Flory. Actually, I want to echo Flory's message, in particular on trade facilitation. So one of the anecdotes I heard personally about was that about 5 years ago, it would take probably 3 weeks for a container to travel from Kenya to Uganda. But now that journey, 1,000 kilometers, could take less than a week. So Laura, has that been your experience working in Africa, you know, as UPS?
Yeah, we'd love to get that transit time down to a day or less, let me tell you. And I'm going to talk about that at the end because we have some exciting new things that we're doing in Africa that aren't just about, you know, moving up a value chain or a production chain, but actually leapfrogging and bringing incredible new innovations into certain countries. And I'll talk about that at the end. But I just want to say thank you to GW and Professor Chen for this event. I want to especially say thank you to Citi for organizing this, because Africa is near and dear to my heart given my past career. And I think this is an exciting time to be talking about the opportunities, because Flory said it best, there is a lot of economic opportunity across the continent. I currently serve as the Vice Chair for the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa, and we just sent a letter to President Trump indicating all the areas in which there are tremendous opportunities to really strengthen our engagement with the countries across the continent. And you better believe we're going to be pushing collectively and individually to see greater engagement by this administration. But many of you likely know UPS. We operate in 220 countries and territories, and our package cars, our cargo containers, our airplanes are filled with all kinds of different customers' products, from the small and medium-sized companies to all the way up to the large, big producers of products. We actually carry 2% of global GDP, and so for us, Africa is a real strategic opportunity, because when you look at where things, that there's a lot of opportunities to grow, the countries across the African continent represent that opportunity for a lot of the reasons that the previous panel talked about and that Flory talked about. These are populations that include a rising middle class, young and growing populations. And what do they want? They want the latest tech products. They want the access to healthcare. They want all those goods that allow them to improve their economic capabilities as well as their standard of living. And yes, UPS wants to be shipping that stuff all across the continent. We currently operate in 51 countries. We're wholly owned in South Africa and Morocco. But in the rest of the countries, we operate with local partners. And so we believe in those kind of local partnerships because a lot of the entities that we work with understand the local environment in many ways better than we do. And so we have a lot of good partnerships that we want to see grow. But guess what the big challenge is for us? It's that barrier at the border. We find so many challenges in terms of bringing goods in and bringing goods out, because that border is a huge challenge. We can't get advanced clearances of goods coming in. Things are held at the border because of all kinds of paper processings. Nothing's done electronically, and electronically you can move things a lot faster. And by the way, the beauty of electronic customs processes on another level is Bitstreams don't ask for bribes. You have the ability to move things across borders faster, efficiently, and without that corruption and bribery element that has been a challenge in many of the markets that we've been operating in across sub-Saharan Africa. You also have to have the kind of approval processes and mechanisms in place to be able to move goods quickly, and that means you have to have agreement on those rules from country to country. And what do you think is another big challenge for us? It's the fact that sometimes customs offices are closed when you get to the border. I have been and visited many countries where they've got long lines of trucks waiting for that customs office to open. UPS does not like to see trucks sitting. We like to see planes moving, trucks moving. We want no delays because those delays translate into costs for our customers. And so we really want to be working with governments to try to find ways to really make that border work for small and medium-sized companies and the bigger companies. And guess what the ready-made opportunity is? It's right there in front of us. It's the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It is such a powerful tool for economic development and economic growth, and it's right there for all the countries to adopt. And I couldn't agree more with what Professor Moore from the previous panel was saying. You don't need to wait for a free trade agreement to make those changes because they make good economic sense. And we get the fact that implementing a lot of these processes and changes and rules, it's complicated. You need support and assistance. UPS partnered with the World Bank and a number of other organizations to provide that technical assistance as well as that financial assistance through the Trade Facilitation Group to really help countries implement a lot of these commitments from the Trade Facilitation Agreement faster. I know that there's a couple pilots underway. I know there's one, I think Ghana's got a pilot, and Kenya and Morocco's going to be next. We'd love to see a lot more pilots across all of the countries, because when you make the borders easier to cross, a lot more trade happens. And you know what? When a lot more trade happens, companies grow, jobs are created, economic opportunity flourishes. And so we're big champions of that, and we're not just asking for the changes, we're working with governments to help them implement them. We've got a lot of experience. We cross 220 countries, territories, borders every day, and so we want to help make those processes better for everyone. I will add that one other area that we have been partnering with certain countries in Africa, and we started with one that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm going to make it really personal. Anybody who knows my background knows I served in Kigali, Rwanda during the genocide. It was probably the most life-changing experience I've ever had. I saw the worst of humanity and as a first-hand witness to genocide. Fast forward 22 years later, I finally got the courage to go back to Rwanda, and guess what I was there doing? I was launching a brand new service that UPS is offering now in Rwanda for the first time ever in the world, and it's an example of where a country has leapfrogged and taken incredible new innovation into their country. In partnership with President Kagame, we launched a drone service for delivery of life-saving blood and medicines to clinics across Rwanda. We didn't do that in Los Angeles. We didn't do that in Berlin. We did it in Kigali, Rwanda. And it is the most powerful example of that partnership with a very forward-looking government that says, how can we do things faster, better, smarter, more efficiently, and address one of the issues that we have in our country, which is access to health care. The highest rate of mortality among women in sub-Saharan Africa actually comes from postpartum hemorrhaging. Can you imagine giving birth to a baby and then not having that life-saving blood transfusion and your baby automatically becomes an orphan? UPS, partnering with the Ministry of Health, has been able to find a solution so that we can deliver blood anywhere in the country in 15 minutes or less. That's significant because Rwanda is known as the land of 1,000 hills. Let me tell you, driving through those roads, it takes an awful long time to get from here to there, and when it's raining, you're not going anywhere fast. Those drones fly through any weather, and they deliver those life-saving medicines as well as blood supplies. And we're really excited about that because that innovation happened in Rwanda. Why? Because the government had that forward-looking approach, adopted the right policies and practices, partnered with us, and we delivered a solution with them. That's pretty exciting. So I'm a big believer in you don't have to progressively move up these chains of value-added possibilities. You can leapfrog and do amazing just in that partnership with a government and a company and the right policy framework. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for sharing, Laura. So, trade facilitation is one of the key priorities. That's very clear from the message here. And Masu, I know in your capacity at the Trade Development Bank, right? Well, this is one of your core missions: is to finance infrastructure, is to finance trade in general, intra-regional and extra-regional trade. Can you tell us a little bit about your development, the developments in these areas in your role?
Thank you. Do I press here? Yeah. Also learning for it. Yes, we've been very busy because the issue of trade facilitation, both from a trade finance point of view as well as trade-related infrastructure, these are core mandate areas for us. We've been active in these areas for decades, but since the turn of the millennium, the bank has found that the environment has been much more conducive for actually doing the financing, because it's not just a supply side issue, it's a demand side problem. And the demand has to be effective, the demand has to be credible. Many banks talk about bankability. So there can be a lot of demand on your facilities, but if the conditions are not conducive, you cannot actually finance. So the reason I'm saying we've been very busy is because conditions have in fact been as good as they've ever been since independence, really, when you look at the story of Africa's growth. In your opening remarks, Professor, you said something about growth pulling back. It has pulled back, but if you were to adjust the continental averages, if you were just to take out two outliers, huge economies, Nigeria and South Africa, you would see that the numbers are still quite robust. In fact, in my part of the continent, which is Eastern and Southern Africa, you're looking at almost 5 to 6% still growth today. And so where there's growth, there's of course a lot of opportunity to finance, a lot of opportunity to be effective in what you provide to the market. And so infrastructure, trade, industry, agribusiness, housing, you name it, tourism, every sector has excess demand. There is so much demand for finance, and of course by virtue of that there are very sizable gaps. There is a lot of need for additional financing. So we feel that on our balance sheet we've been growing at about 20 to 25% per annum now for 6 or so years. It's been very healthy for the business side of our institution, but also in terms of our mandate execution, it's also been very meaningful in a few years. And it continues, really. I think despite all this talk about the pullback, or is it Africa uprising as opposed to Africa rising? Well, I say for me, it's still Africa rising. Of course, it's not a uniform picture. And the ultimate truth in Africa is that Africa's always been a very uneven place, right? So there's always a lot of variety in the picture. The geography is varied, the economics are varied, the politics is varied. You can't look at a whole continent as one country. And I think that's always the mistake a lot of people make when they look at Africa. 54 countries. You rarely hear of people talking of Europe just simply as Europe. People know that there's the European Union, but immediately people talk about countries. Very few times do you hear people talking about Asia as Asia, right? Everybody knows that there are so many faces of Asia. And so I think in Africa we have fascinating economies that have pulled back from very nasty experiences, as in the case of Rwanda, but many other countries. I mean, the numbers of wars, civil wars in Africa, somebody counted them at the turn of the millennium. versus where we are today, there's almost a 75% reduction in civil wars. So you still have some bad cases here and there, but on the whole, you know, the environment of doing business, I think the panel in the morning talked about a lot of things that you can still do without expecting external institutions or superpowers to actually give you the impetus to get things going. The things that many African countries can do themselves, they've been happening. We've seen that in the macroeconomics. That's why, you know, debt capital markets today have appetite for African issuers in ways that we've never seen in the past. When you look at debt to GDP, most African sovereigns are not over-leveraged. European countries, in many cases, are more leveraged than African countries. And that is why we all see very interesting traction out there. But just in terms of gaps, I think there was a very interesting study that was reported a couple of years ago that just looked at the whole trade finance landscape in terms of the gaps. And the number that emerged in that study was a gap of $100 billion per annum in terms of trade finance. And it's not that the size of that number that was so interesting, but it was the size of that number relative to what people thought the gap was. The expectation was it would be between $25 to $30 billion, and it turned out to be 4 times higher. So there's a huge gap. The good news, of course, is there's been a lot of growth in the banking sector across Africa. We have international banks like Citi, of course, that have been very present and active, together with Barclays and Standard Chartered and others. But you also have a number of African banks, Pan-African banks and regional banks, really going through explosive growth. You're looking at the numbers that I quoted earlier on, 20 to 25%. That's not unique to my bank. Many African banks have been growing at very, very high rates. Of course, some of them are local currencies, so you've got to sort of readjust that. But still, the growth numbers have been very high. And almost 90% of African banks engage in trade finance. So when you see this dramatic growth in banks or in banking assets, you know, you see a corresponding growth in engagement in trade facilitation because it's also very profitable. Trade finance in Africa is one of the most profitable segments of commercial banking you can do. So there is a lot of excitement, a lot of demand. Banks are moving and taking advantage of the opportunities because where there are huge gaps, there are huge opportunities. There are, of course, issues nowadays with unexpected institutional matters that have complicated access to finance, especially trade. That is the whole regime around anti-money laundering. Of course, it's a very important governance issue. There's a lot of unexpected constraints that have come around that. A lot of international banks have lost appetite to do trade finance confirmations in Africa. And so that has created new gaps and new constraints and new challenges. We've been fortunate because we're an international bank, we're rated, and we're rated better than most African banks. So our partners like Citi haven't given up on us. In fact, they keep giving us facilities which we're very pleased about, and so have others. But many domestic banks are encountering increasing difficulty in terms of being able to access the international financial system, because this whole demand about knowing your clients and the higher levels of diligence that are, of course, understandable because of what's happening worldwide, the insecurity, everybody knows that it has to be done. But it's just the cost to serve has become very high for many international banks, and so as a result, there's been some pulling back. That has been a little bit of a setback, I would say. This was not a problem 5 years ago. Today, it's a big problem. We're seeing banks like Barclays pull out of Africa. They've announced that they're selling their African franchise. And Barclays has been in Africa for over 100 years. I mean, that's a big development. So we're happy that Standard Chartered and Citi, of course, remain in the continent. But even for them, I think they, as much as they have appetite and commitment, they also struggle with some of the institutional complexities that have now come through with all of these new requirements. It has also affected us as well. We also have to be much more diligent, and it actually has an effect of delaying transactions because you can't move as quickly as you might like to. You have to ask a lot of questions, there's a lot of paperwork that needs to be filled in. So there are some of these new constraints, but I think the overall picture is a very positive one. The intra-Africa trade story, of course, is a recurring theme. It's not a new issue. It's been on the cards for decades. From the inception of independence, every African leader with any kind of inspiration has always made reference to more integration, more intra-Africa trade, more cross-border investment. But in reality, of course, it's not been easy to do for a variety of reasons. I think the institutional frameworks have just not helped, both on the trade side and the border side of issues, but also in terms of just environment, investment climate, environment doing business. But I think the good news for everybody is these areas of concern have been focus areas for a good decade now. You see leaders tracking where they sit in the indexes. They watch the surveys. They want to see their movement. They want to see their comparative position vis-a-vis their neighboring countries, because there is a much greater awareness today that performance matters and that you are competing for limited resources. And so I think the beauty of all the reforms and the engagements in recent and the past decade actually has seen a much greater sense of awareness and keenness actually to perform. We've heard the story of Rwanda, but in fact there's quite a few countries that continue to impress all of us, and by being in the top 10 countries in the world that are reforming fastest and that are really bringing about a sea change in the way in which they're organized domestically. And so I think when you cancel out the noise from the little setbacks here and there, it's still a very compelling continent in terms of investment opportunity. I think the returns, I think Laurie has mentioned how profitable Africa is. In fact, we are beneficiaries of that as well. I think others have also felt the benefits of taking risks in Africa, because if you manage and calculate your risks well, you actually do very well. Right? You just have to get away from the catastrophic kind of things that set you back big time. But otherwise, you have a very good run. And I think there's something that hasn't been mentioned this morning. There was reference to the next big thing being e-commerce, ICT-based, and all of that, which is very true around education and accessibility. But there's also continuing revolution happening in the infrastructure space. Because we were talking about transport infrastructure and institutional issues around transport. But the power sector is also becoming a very interesting space in Africa. In fact, the first decade of the new millennium was a decade for telecommunications in Africa. The leapfrogging actually happened there in a very real and exciting way. Now we're seeing the leapfrogging probably starting to come in the power sector, not just in terms of big grid investments, but also off-grid investments that takes into account new technologies, renewable energy as well, coming through in ways that really wasn't part of the picture even a few years ago. And the reality of the revolution that's coming through in the power sector also has huge implications for trade. Because one of the things that's always been referred to in Africa about trade is that most African countries are producing raw materials and not adding value. There's no differentiation in the product and service suite of what's being offered. So there's no complementarity. So you sell everything to those who process, and those are far away. So if everybody's producing tea and coffee, nobody needs tea and coffee with those smart. You sell it to Japan and the US and the EU. But what's very interesting now is you are seeing diversification in terms of value addition, the agribusiness. But in the power sector, there's such a huge gap in terms of demand for power. 34 African countries experience regular power outages. There's demand, but there's just not enough supply. And now with the liberalization of the power sector, you're seeing new supply coming online through independent power producers, in some countries through some public sector, state-led investments. What we're going to start to see in the years to come is also trade in power across the border. Now that's big ticket stuff, right? When you start trading, selling 300-400 megawatts of power from Ethiopia to Tanzania or from the DRC in the future to Botswana, this is big stuff, right? So the statistics that we're lamenting about, the 13 and 12%, this kind of development can actually be a nice big push to get the numbers up. Not many people realize that out of Africa's 400 billion import bill, 14% of that is in agriculture. Now everybody knows that Africa has got a huge arable land, lots of water, huge potential to grow, as well as add value. But about $60 billion for food is imported, agricultural product is imported to Africa. Now this doesn't even require huge multilateral agreements. We finance trade between some of our countries, maize and other products as well. It's not big enough, but I think if we can get some of this border stuff to open up and to become more efficient, and just streamline business processes, you can actually have a lot of very productive trade just in food and agriculture. People who know Africa today will tell you there's a drought going on, and there's several countries that are badly in need of food to import. They have money to import. There's not a problem in terms of, there may be population groups that won't have access within a country. That's a social policy issue, but at a macroeconomic level, national food security, you have governments willing to pay to import food. And so Zambia has taken advantage of that. They've been selling maize to a number of countries. And now in East Africa, we're also seeing a number of countries, experiencing bumper crops at a time when there's drought in many neighboring countries. And if we can fix that problem, you're looking at a $60 billion opportunity for those countries that can organize their agribusiness space. And you're not even talking value addition, just the plain maize or the wheat or the sorghum. There's so much opportunity for that kind of trade. So when you step below the radar, you actually see a lot of opportunities. And what people don't see is the interconnectedness. All the stuff that Laura has spoken about, actually has a huge impact on unlocking this opportunity in the agriculture space. Textiles, the AGOA initiative, it's all held back by logistics. I've seen studies that show the unit of production in African factories where that unit of production is much lower than that you'll find in China, on par with parts of India. The African production becomes uncompetitive the minute the product leaves the factory gate, and then the costs start piling up, and then it's no longer competitive. But there's so much going on now to deal with infrastructure, and it's not a new thing. It's been a focus for quite some time now.
Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks for providing this more comprehensive picture to talk about, the variations we're seeing across the region, right? And so my next question is for John. In your experience, right? So I know you have been deeply involved, obviously, in trade financing and global value chain building around the world. So how do you see trade in Africa being similar or different from different parts of the world that you have worked at? And where should we look for, examples of best practice, either in Africa or outside Africa?
Okay, so look, I think there's a variety of different issues that you have to look at, right? So first of all, one of the things I think is very important for Africa to realize is when you talk about trade, you talk about global trade. So as Africa is looking to compete in the manufacturing sector, et cetera, there's a lot of other countries around the world that are looking to do exactly the same, and they're making those kind of infrastructure investments that we need. I think the first thing that's very, very important, so I would say 90-95% of all cities, trade, finance that's done in Africa is structured or done through my team, which includes OPEC, USXN, and not only the infrastructure stuff, but the trade finance stuff. And what's really interesting is Africa still is very, very commodity focused. And that's making it quite difficult because continues to go through the boom and bust of the commodity cycles, right? So there has to be a diversification of the trade flows if Africa is really going to succeed. One of the most important things I think for Africa is a large part of the population growth that's expected over the next 20, 30 years are going to happen in Africa. And one of the problems we as a global society are going to have is we're going to have excess human capacity, right? As manufacturing continues to improve, the need for people to do that manufacturing is going to continue to decrease. So for me, Africa really has to concentrate on the logistics side. Very simple to what we're saying, right? When we talk to our global clients, we talk very commonly about supply chain finance, etc. We inject a lot of liquidity into their supply chains. But the logistics is the most important part. They're looking about how do I finance things in transit? How do I move things from this country to that country quicker? And if Africa doesn't make those developments, we're seeing India, which has been historically a very, very paper-intense economy. And the reason it's been a very paper-intense economy is because they use it as a job program, right? You go to India and there's 4 guys needed to stamp a piece of paper, because that way each one of those guys has a job from the government, right? They're now working on digitizing that entire import-export flow, right? So they're willing to get rid of the job because they recognize if they're going to continue on their value chain, they have to have easy access to the economy. So that's important. The other thing, and it goes back to what one of the panels was saying before, what's very interesting that we're seeing, and we talk about doing consulting work or working together. Well, we and our other large financial institution partners are being forced into what I consider free consultancy, right? So the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Singapore Monetary Authority have come to us and said, okay, you guys do business in our economy, you guys have banking license in our economy, we want you now to come together and work with us to show us best practices. How do we make the financial system have less friction? How do we move things? We don't see those kind of things coming out of Africa yet, right? And again, these are things that are behind the board. There's no reason why one of the monetary authorities of one of the African countries couldn't summon the banks and say, okay, let's get together and have a conversation. The other thing which is very interesting, and you would mention it, the lack of access to the global clearing systems. It's very interesting. So the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, in trade today, one of the technologies that everyone's talking about quite heavily is blockchain, right? So whether or not blockchain truly works, we have no idea. But what's interesting is the HKMA invited Citi and about 5 or 6 other large banks in their country to come in and start working with them on blockchain. And the regulator came out and said there's no foul, right? So we will protect you so that if you don't quite do, KYC, AML perfect in the economy, or if we need to change the regulations, we'll do that. One of the problems you're going to have is, and I really don't think the Basel Committee understood what they were doing when they really started pushing, or the US government when they started pushing KYC, AML, right? This is all an economic conversation for the banks. So if you go back historically, what happened was the way a bank could show that it was, well regarded, that it would have 100 correspondent banks, 150 correspondent banks, right? And that was how they kind of showed themselves to the world. Today, it's become an economic conversation. Depending on what bank you're talking about, our cost for KYC AML could be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. So if you have a very, very small bank that's got a very, very small wallet, and the most we can make off that bank is $20,000 or $30,000, and our cost for just entering into that bank is $50,000, that conversation is not very difficult to have, right? And the other thing is, the more of this you do, the larger the opportunity is to get it wrong. And if you look at the fines today that the banks are paying, they're mind-boggling. Historically I worked for ABN AMRO many, many years ago, and we got fined, and our fine for violating, KYC AML was $25 million. And everyone was aghast. It was the largest in the industry. The fines today are in the billions. So it's very, very difficult to make an economic case of, these guys are a little dicey, we can't make much money from them, but why don't we bank them anyway, right? I mean, those conversations just don't happen today. But there are opportunities, you know, within the governments of Africa to have those conversations and say, how do we make it better? Is there a process that we can aggregate the KYC AML for our banks? Can we set a standard to make sure that they're of the quality that you need so that they're bankable? One of the things that I'm very, very concerned about, and Africa is a good example, you have very diverse population sectors, and you also have very diverse banks. So if you have a bank that is, for whatever reason, too small in an urban region, or a region that really isn't that heavily banked, and that bank can't get access to the international systems, all of those people will be left out of the global economy, right? And it's still very, very interesting. We have we're very large in trade. About 85% of our portfolios today are still US dollar based. US dollars is the global currency. I know the Chinese tried to replace it a while ago, etc., but it's not happening. So if these banks don't have access to US dollars, or they don't have access to US dollar clearing, they're closed out of the global economy. So it's very, very important. So I think we are very, very excited about Africa. I think one of the things that's very interesting is there is an enormous amount of money today looking to be lent. If you look at my division, we lend off of global flows, and global flows have been down for the last 2 years or so. So we're looking for good deals. Then the other side of the equation you have is with all the quantitative easing that's been happening around the world, the banks are stuffed with money, right? So we're looking for good bankable deals. But it can't be just a pure commodity deal, because most of those commodity transactions that were done at the height of the commodity boom are in trouble. There's a lot of countries that went out and leveraged their commodity flows quite heavily at the wrong time, and we've restructured a lot of those, and a lot of their commodity flows are now pledged for deals they did 2 or 3 years ago, because when oil was $100 a barrel, they took huge amounts of money. Oil now flows into prepaid deals. Oil goes to 50. You still have to you have to cover that debt, right? So we are looking for deals. We are looking for non-commodity deals in Africa in particular, and we're looking for bankable transactions. And it's not just Citi. This is a global phenomenon. Barclays, Standard Chartered, HSBC, all of us are in the same position.
Okay, all right. Now, in the next few minutes, I want to invite our speakers, just very briefly, to do two things that economists don't do really well, but we do all the time, is to make some forecasts about what we should expect going forward in Africa, especially African trade, and make some suggestions and recommendations for the practices and policies.
So I think in terms of where CCA is, one of the major areas that I think holds tremendous promise is small and medium-sized enterprises. There's this gap, and I think that because the majority of Africa's businesses are small and medium-sized, we know that there are hundreds of companies that have revenues of more than $1 billion, so I'm not discounting them. Very important. But when you think about where the growth will be, I think that this is an area where we will need to figure out ways to tap and to link them to larger firms, both within Africa, as well as from where I sit in the U.S. And I think the other piece of this is small and medium-sized businesses on the U.S. side. There's also an opportunity there for looking at ways to pull them together. An example of this, I had a group of people come in the other day. They were talking about the diaspora and talking about how years ago the remittances that were going to Africa were largely focused on helping families, school fees, et cetera, but that now there's actually quite a bit of money in terms of remittances, which actually are something like 4 times the amount of all the development assistance that Africa gets. And so, you know, without knowing exactly what it is we need to do, I have this sense that there is this tremendous opportunity that's been untapped on both sides, and which can also benefit larger companies as they are required in a lot of countries now to try to, you know, the local content and localization policies, sort of how do you make sure that there is a wider benefit from the economic growth that countries are having. And so I think there's a link to that point, spreading sort of the economic, maybe not spreading economic wealth, but spreading the economic opportunities across a wider group of people on the continent, but then also the ways that that can be facilitated by looking at partnerships that might happen also from the U.S. side. So CCA, just to very quickly, we have lots of large corporations that are members, you know, from GE to Boeing to Microsoft, et cetera. But actually more than 50% of our members are small and medium-sized companies. And so we're actually looking at what it is that needs to happen to help them engage more effectively with African businesses on the continent who also happen to be medium-sized. Someone reminded me, though, that a medium-sized company in the U.S. will still sometimes look like, you know, quite large to some of the quote-unquote small and medium-sized businesses on the other side. But that notwithstanding, the point is that you have SMEs there and SMEs here. And I just think that there's this huge opportunity if we can do this right. I can see it having real implications for economic growth on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah. Anybody wants to join?
So I love when I get these questions because I've got this really good crystal ball, and it's all based on process. I was asked who was going to win the presidential election, and I was able to answer it's the person who got the most electoral votes. The same applies in the Africa context in terms of, kidding aside, the same applies in terms of the African context. Which countries are going to grow fastest? The ones that move up fastest on the World Bank's logistics index. The ones that implement the trade facilitation agreement the fastest. It's not rocket science. You make things cross borders faster, bring inputs in, export goods out. You've got the ready-made secret sauce that brings economic growth and opportunity, and that's all that needs to happen, and then you build from that.
Okay, the message is loud and clear, yes.
I'm going to borrow her crystal ball and say that the institutional infrastructure is going to be key. But I think if you take the physical infrastructure, the hardware side of things, and say that is a leading indicator of what is to come in the future, it's like anybody who knows what happens if a nice road is built close to your land. You know what's going to happen to the value of your land, right? It's just going to go up. You can do a lot of stuff with your land. The hardware that's coming into the infrastructure space, railroads. Nobody in this room has mentioned railroads, but if anybody were to just do a little bit of an exercise and find out how much is being invested in railroads in Africa today, it's billions of US dollars, more than just 1 or 2 countries, in a handful of countries. These are investments in railroads that we've not seen since independence, since 50 years. Now the sheer size of these investments that are coming through in multiple modalities of transport will put so much pressure on the public sector to ensure that the dividends are realized. So the software issues that are significantly lacking, as my 2 colleagues here have highlighted very well, logistics, but even the institutional and the banking side, there are a lot of issues there. But the more you invest in the hardware and you put so much of your skin into the game, the public sector will be under huge pressure to ensure that there's delivery now, there is the return on that investment. So I'm banking on that.
Great. I mean, I'm with you. I'm from China. You know, I understand the importance of railroads and infrastructure. So, John.
Well, I'm sorry, I have a negative view.
So, but when we project our business forward 3 to 4 years, and we're seeing modest growth, maybe 2 to 3%. There's a whole variety of things that still have to work through the system. Protectionism is still out there. People have not really realized what protection is all about. So everybody wants high-paying jobs in their community, and they still want to buy their flip-flops for $5, right? And that strategy isn't going to work, right? So that hasn't played its way out altogether. I think Africa is in a very unique position. I think one of my panelists or colleagues mentioned that they're not over-leveraged. You still have enormous parts of the world that are way over-leveraged. For example, Europe's going to take a long time to work out of that. Even the U.S. to a degree is over-leveraged. So I think there are some opportunities for the emerging market, but a lot of it's going to have to come from the infrastructure. You need to get the infrastructure in place. Once you get the infrastructure in place, then you bring the manufacturing. It's got to be a public-private sector kind of partnership. The public sector's got to be there to facilitate those kind of trades and change the rules, and then that's going to bring manufacturing jobs. And in my view, that's really the future for Africa, is to get away from the pure commodity economies and get into manufacturing. And that means the public sector and the private sector have to work together to get that done.
Okay, all right, so, yeah, we are running out of time, unfortunately. So is there any question? We're happy to take one question, I guess.
The answer, no matter what, is logistics.
All right, so let me introduce our
Yes, I just
Julie Monaco.
I just want to quickly wrap up and
Yeah.
thank, first of all, I want to thank Dean Brigadier, who's not here right now, but thank him for working with us. When we came up with this concept a few months ago, and Peter Sullivan, leading this from the city side, the concept being that the backdrop was a lot in the press about multilateralism, about trade agreements, about the protectionism, anti-globalization, and all those themes, and people started debating that, and we said, well, how is that going to impact Africa? And what should Africa be thinking about in terms of its own economic growth and development? And I think what we heard today, and there was too many great things. I want to thank the panelists because I think it was an incredible amount of information on both panels. That too much to summarize, but the key theme that came out of it is that it's within Africa's control to control its destiny. That most of the issues are about what we call behind the border issues that have to do with leadership of the public sector, of the governments, partnership with the private sector, getting the institutional framework in place that's going to support diversification of the economy, the right investments in the right infrastructure, and that if that's done, it does not have to be done in the context of international trade agreements or regional trade agreements to drive regional or global trade. It can be done just for your own economies, and once that infrastructure is there, it's going to naturally lead to more trade. So I really want to thank everybody for their time and for coming to the session, and hopefully everybody will stay behind and get to meet each other and talk more about this over the reception. Thank you.
Thank you.